Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. We're doing an episode today on Saint Anacletus, who is the second after Peter, Bishop of Rome. Now, we've already talked about Saint Linus, who came directly after Saint Peter. And we've even mentioned in passing that there's a lot of controversy around these figures for a couple of reasons. Number one, their information and their writings don't exist. It's easier to trace people like Polycarp, even though we have very little from him, but because we have something from him, we get an idea of who he is. And then corresponding back and forth with Ignatius of Antioch, we not only learn about Polycarp, we learn about Ignatius, and Ignatius teaches us about Polycarp and back and forth. So it's nice to have that kind of discussion because we have something to work with. We have framework. Whereas before we look at Ignatius of Antioch, you have Evodius, who we know almost nothing about. The same thing is true of St. Linus. We talked about some of those elements about him last time. After St. Linus had died, somewhere between 78, 79, 80, somewhere in those years, I think it was closer to 79, 80, we see another person take the position of bishopric in Rome named Anacletus. Now, there's a little bit of controversy about him because some people debate whether or not there were two people or one person. And so we come into these discussions, and as I said, number one, it's difficult to assess these people because they didn't write anything at all, like we see with Ignatius or Polycarp or some of these others like Clement. On the other hand, the second difficulty that we run into with them is that we don't know much about them because not much is said about them, in addition to nothing saying anything about themselves. And then there's the spellings of names that make it interesting and trying to figure out, wait, is this the same person that's mentioned over here? Or is that a different person? Anacletus is one of those difficulties because he is called Anacletus, Anacletus, and Cletus. And so you have three possible names to our figure today, but most would agree that we're talking about the same figure in church history. He was probably born particularly around this time in the first century. Some would say he was alive sometime in the 30s, right around the time of Jesus's death. We don't know the exact year. Again, pinpointing these things is very, very difficult. But it seemed like he died around the year 92. So he would have started his bishopric somewhere around 79 or 80. He died somewhere between 91 and 92. Some push this further. Some would want us to believe that this went later into the 90s, and that St. Clement of Rome became the bishop after him in the mid-90s as opposed to around 92, 93. Here's one of the things I want to say about these controversies. Who cares? I'm not saying that we don't try to come up with the best date possible. I'm not saying we don't try to come up with some sort of timeline that is effective, and we do the best that we can with it. But some people really lose sleep over this thing. Well, we just don't know what's reliable. We don't know if these people were actually bishops of Rome. Well, no, none of that is held in check on the basis of these dates. We assess as best as we can based on statements we have from Jerome, statements we have from Hegesippus, statements we have from Irenaeus, statements we have from Tertullian. We try to assess as much as we can from the early citing of Roman practice, and we get ourselves names and locations and ideas and concepts, and we do the best that we can with it. But we can condense it to a 3 to 5 year span at worst with what little information we do have. As information became more prominent, we do find it's a lot easier to assess timeline period, bishopric, who's there, who's not there, how they died, when they died. It gets a little bit easier as we continue through. A lot of that is due to the fact that Christianity was illegal. It was very difficult to get documents out. And there was quite a bit of people in the church that were entrusted with it that were not super educated, skillful people. They were just God-fearing, loved people, servants, worked hard to help people, help the sick, help the weak, help the lame, the maimed. I mean, these were the people that were bringing in all these children who were on the streets and caring for them and adopting them. These are the people that are helping the widows and orphans. I mean, that was what they were put in place for. as time goes on, necessity would rise that great writers would need to be given to the church to defend its Christian faith, to defend its historicity, like Tertullian, or guys like Irenaeus, or guys that come into play later and defend its text, like Origen. These things were necessary, but at the beginning stage, that was not the focal point of these early leaders. You have the same setup going on in Jesus's ministry. We don't see writing coming immediately after his ascension. We don't see these things taking place until later, when necessity demanded writing. And the earliest time period we could probably point to is the late 40s, early 50s of the New Testament, like the Epistle of James or like the Gospel of Mark. We do not start seeing this immediate impact of writing and things that go on in that early stage, outside of perhaps maybe St. Luke, who writes in the epistles, particularly going through Acts, particularly possibly writing for Hebrews, for Paul, as we've talked about in this program before. Now, all of a sudden, we see a rise of writing when skilled writers come in after the fact. And I mean 20, 30 years after the fact. So now the apostolic age has been set with New Testament texts. We have the circulation of the Gospels, particularly the first three. We have a writing of Acts and the history of the church and kind of what happened in bits and pieces going up to the time of Paul's imprisonment. Now we start seeing Paul's letters circulating as well. We start seeing some of the Petrine letters going around. Now we're starting to see the apostolic writings become the very thing that is used for homilies, that are used for memorization and implementing things of creed. Oral tradition has come in. Now you have oral tradition and written tradition working side by side. And for a while, that's what's assessed up to the end of the first century into the early part of the second. And it's not until the late second century we start seeing the highlighted amount of citations of the church fathers in the early stage or the New Testament text, seeing a lot of the information coming into play as what happened to this person, how they died in martyrdom. But during that period between Linus and Anacletus, we do not see a lot happening in that 70s and 80s and 90s until the Johannine corpus is finalized in the end of the first century, into some of these other areas, like the writings that we see with Clement of Rome, the Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas. And now we have something that we can start building on up to Justin Martyr all the way to Irenaeus. So when we look at guys like Anacletus and Linus, we are left with very little because they were in that gap of transition, similar to right after the time Jesus died into when necessity demanded writing. And it could be that a lot of these guys were not very educated and they weren't writers. They were orators, sharing what they learned in their time with the apostles and just teaching their message throughout the city. Now, what we have demonstrated of importance is that one of the things that St. Linus had done is he started establishing other priests. He started ordaining priests in the city of Rome. Well, Anacletus comes around and he moves into a position where he sees it necessary to start moving people to different parishes, or having kind of a diocese that is operated by the bishopric, but has its priests that Linus had already started ordaining and training, are now put into action to lead individual parishes in the different provinces of Rome. And so he becomes instrumental here, where he ordains more priests in addition to Linus, and he sets up what we believe to be 25 different parishes that are spread out through the Roman regions. Now, we see some of this being given to us in different writings. So let's kind of talk about him, the man. Let's talk about him as a person. His name, if you go by the first spelling, Cletus, is from the word kletos in Greek, and it means one who has been called, a person who has been called. We see this consistent with disciples and their names. And it's also not shocking that we see different spellings come into play to kind of bring nuances to these people. I mean, this happened with multiple disciples in Jesus's ministry, where their names were completely changed, or their names were built on and created to make it more complete. I mean, we see this in the Old Testament with Abram to Abraham, or Sarai to Sarah. I mean, this is not an unusual practice, so we shouldn't be shocked to see spelling differences or at times just copying it down and spelling it different, which I'll give it an illustration of in just a second. Now, if it is Anacletus or Anacletus, as we pronounce it, now that Greek word has a little bit new idea to it. It means one who has been called back. Being one who is called Cletus, Anacletus is to be returned or to call back, to bring back to something. Now, there may be some connotation of that we can only stipulate upon because we don't know the full end of why that is there. Maybe he was called to something and he was called back to do something else. Here's my theory. What we find about the order of the Roman bishops is a little bit mixed up at times because it seems like when you read Tertullian that it goes Peter and Clement, and that's it. And then he also does the same thing with Polycarp and John. Now, we know there was another bishop in Smyrna before Polycarp, so maybe Tertullian isn't going chronological as much as by identifiable sources. See, he uses Clement and Polycarp. It could be because they're the only ones with writings. The one that preceded Polycarp does not. The ones that precede Clement, like Anacletus, does not have any writings attributed to them. And so he could be giving us landmarks on the basis of the fact that they have continued the tradition of the writings of the apostles in their own writings. Another thing about Tertullian that's interesting in this is that when he puts Clement second and everybody else seems to place him fourth, what it could be as well is that Clement and Anacletus were alive during the time of Peter, and he ordained all of them to the leadership of the church being a bishopric. But one of them was given rise over the others in succession, meaning Peter could have ordained with Paul, Linus, Anacletus, and Clement together. They were all ordained by the apostles and approved men. But at that point, Linus was designated to be, if you would, the bishop of Rome. And these others were serving alongside of him as bishops. Folks, the system is still in that way today. We see suffragan bishops, assisting in different ways and different roles. And then once Linus died, Anacletus was designated and he was put forward, which could be because of age. This could be an age thing here. Some of these were the older ones and more seasoned or spent more time. So it could be that Anacletus's name means one who has been called back, is that he was Cletus when he was ordained by Peter and Paul. And once Linus died, he was called back to Rome. He could have been serving other jurisdictions and other places outside of the Roman, in the other areas of the Roman Empire. And now he's being brought back to the city of Rome to be the leader and the bishop of Rome. It could be that's where the name Anacletus came from. Now, there's another spelling, as I mentioned before, and it's Anacletus with the E-N. Instead of A-N-A-C, it's A-N-E-N-C. And that means impeachable or blameless. Now, that could have happened from some sort of spelling and transmission. We don't know, but all three names have been associated with the same guy. Some try to make distinctions. I don't think that needs to be done. I think Anacletus was probably the name given to him at his bishopric of Rome, as opposed to just being appointed by the apostles and serving in the churches in the greater sense. Now, at the time as the bishop of Rome, again, some would consider him one of the early popes. In this time, I stated he set up 25 different parishes, and he took all of these men that were being trained and appointed by Linus and himself to become leaders and priests of these churches. Now, these are underground. These are not legal to do, but yet they are growing as the persecution consistently moves forward. And Anacletus, again, by Irenaeus' statement, is second after Peter. And we see this consistent with others. And later he's succeeded by Clement of Rome. Now, it is accepted that he was around the years of 22 years as a bishop. So that could have been anywhere from 79 all the way over to 91, as we talked about, or 80 to 92, which I think is the best date to give to our character today. Now, according to those of the Pontifico, we find that this statement is made about him. For the first 2 centuries, the dates of the start and the end of the pontificate are uncertain, before placing Anacletus pontificate from 80 to 92 AD. These are the years given also by Jerome, Eusebius, by the way, and others have frequently given it around this time. Now, there are some that say it's earlier, like I said, from 76 or later, from 76 on to 88, and some say it's earlier, some say it's later. I don't think we really need to get into that. I think the conservative date works with what we have from Eusebius, Jerome, and even some of the subscripts that we have through different writings of his leadership. Now, according to some, he was martyred. We don't have that stated by others, but some say he was martyred, and that's how he died. Now, a tomb has been ascribed to him, and it is in St. Peter's tomb in the Vatican. We've kind of talked about this with St. Linus as well, because there were different inscriptions near what was found of the relics of St. Peter. It would make sense if they were buried near him and beside him, given the situation they were all in and what they had available to them, the leadership role that was taking place there. Now, there is in this tomb ascribed to Linus, and we talked about how that could be a spelling issue there as well, Evastius, Telesphorus, Hyginus, Pius, Anicetus, and Victor. These are names that are listed in these tombs. Now, his name is included in Roman canons of the Mass. If you go to a Mass for the church, and you're sitting there in a Roman Catholic Mass, you'll hear the prayers during the Eucharistic prayer, as I mentioned for St. Linus. Well, guess who follows under St. Linus? Some will read it as Cletus, some will say Anacletus, if you listen very carefully, if you're attending a Mass in the near future. So he is venerated. He is venerated as a saint, and we would expect it to be so. Now, the East celebrates his feast day in July 13th. Whereas the Latin or the Roman traditions place it around April 26th. So that'll be coming up actually really, really soon. Now, we don't have anything written from him, as I stated before. We don't know anything about his history, but we do find something interesting in Dante. Now, Dante says this about him. He mentions him as being placed in heaven of the fixed stars, and that's in Paradiso 27:41. So he is seen as a saint. He is in the beatific vision. He's participating in that. That is why he's called upon in the Mass. He is given this opportunity. Now, one of the things that I want to say about these early church leaders, and I think that it becomes overly criticized, and then there's one aspect of the over criticism, and then the over embellishment is on the other end of this. And I want to be careful as we continue to go through this. As I stated previously, these individuals were simple people. There's a part of the embellishment crowd that makes some of these saints, and they deserve praise, and they deserve our thoughts and our intent, and even to be seen in a high regard. But remember what the church was. Remember what the scenery is around them. It's illegal. Christians are persecuted. These men in positions are being killed for being these leaders. We see martyrdoms of the apostles. We see martyrdoms of their successors like Anacletus, and we see it later on with others. This is not a popular time to be a leader. There's no accolades here. I mean, you're not getting an applause. You're not getting a standing ovation when you walk in the public marketplace. This is a time of persecution. This is a time of making decisions of what you're willing to live without. Because to follow Jesus and to be a follower in this ministry means you need to be willing to live without things. You need to give up things that are in your life. This was a life of sacrifice. So what ends up happening is that we look at these people and we parade them in proper manner at times, but then we overdo it, expecting them to have done so much more. And it is a pity. I wish Anacletus would have wrote 7 letters like Ignatius. I wish St. Linus would have written at least 1 or 2 letters like Polycarp. I would have loved to see this because we would learn so much with so little. And yet we don't have much at all except statements about or something that involves them, or they're just listed with a group of people in a certain order. So when I think of Saint Anacletus, I think of a simple man. He wasn't some higher, well-known, popular guy in the streets. When he walked down the roads in Rome, nobody was like, oh, there he is, I think he was probably known for being a gentle spirit who cared deeply about people and their suffering. I think he was probably a person who was there for his people, who wanted to continue the teaching of the apostles and share that with others. It cannot be understated how he took 25 separate parishes and made sure they had priests available for them to partake of the sacraments and to continue to be blessed in the work of the church by Jesus Christ and the working of the Holy Spirit through his people. It's an underrated statement. The transition and the difficulty of a church that is growing under persecution. What they need is not somebody who's a prolific writer defending the Christian faith as an apologist. We needed a Justin Martyr, yes. We needed a Tertullian to make a legal case for Christianity. We needed Irenaeus of Lyons to make a defense of what Christianity was doing and was all about. I'm not saying that we should be upset about those things. I wish we had more of it. But that wasn't the occupation of the bishopric in the early stage of Rome under its conditions. These men were entrusted to defend the faith by living it out more than writing it down at this point. They were people, simple people, who were entrusted under the apostolic eyes and ears to take their message and continue it in the city, grow these churches, and nurture them through the faith that was delivered to the saints. That was their job. That was their objective. And to die doing it. These are unsung heroes who lack publicity, who lack the glimmer and the glamour and all the things that we want to be attached to their name. So that's one element here is we can praise them so highly that we make them out to be these superheroes when they were probably just simple men who were dedicated to the work of the ministry and dedicated to giving their lives to be the arms and the legs and the ears and the eyes of Christ to the church and represent him in persona Christi and the sacraments, and that they were representing the ministry of the apostles well. That was probably the first and foremost priority of these men. Another priority was to continue to train others in doing it. See, as Rome grows, it became more difficult to have an assembly of people to come together in one location, or two, or three. So he seems to be more of an organizer. He organized the churches by separating them regionally and giving them their own individual parishes and priests as he oversaw the training, the sacraments, and the practices of the church from a city's perspective, and continue to do that. He seemed to spend his entire 22 years as the Bishop of Rome making that a priority and starting something that is still practiced today. We are spread out in different jurisdictions and regions. If you go to most Roman Catholic churches today, they are strategically separated. They're not like the Baptist churches where you have First Baptist Church on this side of the road and then you throw a rock on the other side and hit Second Baptist Church that split from each other 50 years prior because they couldn't agree on the color of the carpet or the seating arrangements of people in the pews. I mean, this wasn't the issue. And even today, a lot of the Roman Catholic churches or even some of these apostolic churches are strategic in separating themselves regionally, and each area of a city or a town is designated with their proper leaders who are in place to help them engage issues in their local communities, grow and nurture the Christians in it, participating in the sacraments, giving them something that they can be trained and catechized in, and living it out in the community. That practice, that common practice we see today in these churches originated with ideas that we see in guys like Anacletus, who we would never associate with this, but he was really one of the first ones to start this practice. And so for that, he should be celebrated. So you've got the high praise that needs to be kept in check, and then you've got the praise like I just been describing, where it's like, well, this is what reality looked like. Then there's the criticism of this too. The criticism is from more of the skeptics who come in and say, why in the world do we not have records? Why? I mean, get your story straight. Get your story straight about the bishopric of Rome. Who was truly in charge? Who was truly there? Who are the ones that were really supposed to be going through these cities and doing things? Y'all can't get your story straight. There was no bishopric. It's a mess. We don't know what succession actually looks like. See, I think that's the other end of the spectrum, and I think it's an unnecessary thing. What we can see is most of these men were alive during the time of the apostles. And as I stated, one of the things that was probably happening, and we have good reason to believe this, is that they were all appointed as approved men by the apostolic groups. But one of them was left to lead the others. And as they continued to die, others would step in that role. Again, one of the reasons I think Anacletus' name is Anacletus, which started out under the title and the spelling of Cletus. So here's another reason for the rise of the bishopric that happened there, is that it was a role out of necessity, and it was a role of a death sentence. This wasn't a popularity contest, as I stated. Not even within the church. It was risky. You were a target. When they were arresting these leaders during the time of persecution, yeah, I mean, they arrested lay people too, but the targets were the leaders of the churches. That's why they have martyrdom stories. That's what happened to Ignatius. That's what happened to Polycarp of Smyrna. These men are targets for what they're doing. So to be in this role illegally by the standard of Rome would require these men to engage the issues at hand and do it with the best available sources they have, but also protect the people in the church. And most of the time that probably looked like anonymity. So even if these individuals received or gave out correspondence, especially from Rome, it probably was done with protective anonymity involved in the letters. It's no shock, as I demonstrated in my defense of the Gospel of Mark, that we see the work of protective anonymity happening all the time in the Gospel of Mark that is later unveiled in the Gospel of John after people are dead. And that's probably what we're seeing happen here. When narratives were being told in the Gospels, we see people's names left anonymous. And then all of a sudden, years later, when John's Gospel was penned, possibly 30 to 40 years after the fact, names are tossed out everywhere. Everything from Peter himself being protected in the Gospel of Mark and in Matthew and in Luke. But then all of a sudden, John comes along. Peter's been dead for a while. He's the one that swung the sword, chopped off the ear of, and now they name Malchus, who before was just a servant of the high priest. Now we know it was Peter the whole time. Now we know it was Mary who anointed Jesus's feet. We didn't know that in the synoptics. It was revealed in John. These people are dead and their lives are no longer in jeopardy. That's what we see during these times of the earlier writings, is they're protecting people. And that's probably what was happening in correspondence at the time with these churches when they were delegating 25 parishes to 25 priests. I'm sure there was communication going on. The question is, well, why don't we have it? Well, those letters wouldn't have been circulated. See, think about that. Ignatius's letters were circulated to regions like Ephesus, like Rome, like even going to the bishop of Smyrna himself, Polycarp, then to the church at Smyrna itself. You start seeing that he's writing to multiple areas who are getting copies of these letters and redistributing them. If Anacletus is simply writing to the priests within his own jurisdiction, that's not going to be spread out more and copied more. In fact, it's probably not going to be copied at all. It's going to be received and taught and instructed and then done away with for the sake of protection. So there was probably messengers who were going through the city of Rome who were like, I've got some documents, come read, come one, come all, I don't think that's the way this was going at all. I think that they were very careful with this. I think they were very hidden. They were under the watchful eye of leaders, and in the streets, they were probably trying to play it cool and practical. And then they would get a messenger to these other parishes. Here's a letter from Anacletus, whether he wrote it or had amanuensis write it, saying, here's instruction. This is what we're doing. It may have been something about how to do certain things in church, or how to conduct yourselves, or how to deal with problems. It wouldn't shock me if Anacletus had some sort of correspondence with these local churches, but they were not going to be distributed and reproduced the same way we see a guy like Ignatius or a guy like Clement, who's writing out of the jurisdiction of Rome to the city of Corinth, writing to that church and giving them instruction, or like what we see with Polycarp, who's writing outside of his jurisdiction in Smyrna, writing to the church of Philippi and giving them instruction. That makes more sense when you're writing outside your region, because somebody is now getting it far away. They're now producing it in their area and their location, as opposed to writing it to your own individual location and your own small community of people in your city that you're overseeing, especially when you're under watchful eye, especially when you need to be very careful what you distribute out there and what you're putting out there for people to read and for people to see. So these things need to be kept in mind. Now we're gonna touch Clement of Rome again. We've talked about him so many times in this program, but I think we skip ahead too quickly because there's not a lot said about Anacletus. There's not a lot said about Linus, and so these individuals need to be acknowledged for what they were doing quietly, what they were doing locally, where they weren't able to do things the way that Clement of Rome did, or later on we see in these other positions of the Bishop of Rome, writing to different locations and churches. These men, for the short period of time they led Christ's church in Rome, were just preoccupied with being the best servants they could be and sticking their necks out on the line regularly in order to see the gospel advance in and through the city of Rome for the better and for the furtherance of the gospel out of the city of Rome. All right, folks, that is our saint today, Saint Anacletus. He is the third bishop in Rome, second after Peter, who gave his life perhaps in martyrdom during the end of his life into the early 90s. He led for 22 years, set up 25 parishes, and ordained additional priests to Linus's priests in order to serve the church and bring proper order in the city of Rome. All right, folks, that's all we have time for today. As always, grace and peace to you. God bless.